All right, so welcome to the deep dive, where we take one fascinating source and we kind of squeeze out the good stuff, trying to make you well-informed as quickly as possible.
That's right.
So today we are diving headfirst into Jeff Hawkins' book, A Thousand Brains, A New Theory of Intelligence.
Oh yeah, this is a really exciting one.
Yeah, and to just emphasize how potentially groundbreaking this book is, Richard Dawkins himself wrote the foreword.
Wow.
And he calls it stimulating, and even goes as far as to compare Hawkins to Darwin, calling them both gentlemen scientists, whose ideas were so revolutionary that it took an entire book to really get them across.
Well, and you think about it, sometimes you really need the space of a book to fully, articulate a completely new idea.
Yeah, definitely. So our goal today in this deep dive is to kind of get to the core of Hawkins' argument about how the brain creates intelligence.
Right.
And specifically, we're looking for those surprising insights, the aha moments that could change how you see the world. So think of this deep dive not just as understanding this amazing organ in our heads, but also as a framework for thinking about the future of AI, and even the future of some of the tough challenges that we face as a species.
Well, and even just thinking about the brain itself, like it really is one of the great mysteries, left in science and in the world.
Oh, yeah.
There's so much data about it, but it's almost like, and Hawkins quotes Francis Crick here, that, we don't really know how to put all that data together to make it meaningful.
Right.
It's like having a giant jigsaw puzzle, but you don't have the picture on the box.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, despite, all of the research and all of the things that we've learned about it, we're really still just starting to understand how it works.
That's right.
And the fact that something as complex as intelligence can come from what are basically, fairly simple cells, is still a huge mystery.
It really is a profound mystery.
Yeah. So Hawkins really goes after this, right away in the book. And I think one of his first points is that the brain is not just this like storage device for information like a hard drive.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just, taking in facts and storing them.
Yeah. He says that the brain is constantly learning and building what he calls a model of the world.
Okay. Yeah.
Which is different than just like a collection of data.
So let's break that down a little bit. Like, what does he mean by a model?
Well, it's like if you think about your understanding of something like, I don't know, like a coffee mug. You don't just have a list of facts about coffee mugs in your head.
Okay.
You have like a full model that includes how you hold it, what happens when you tilt it, what it's used for, what it looks like, what it feels like.
Right.
It's a real understanding of the structure of the object and how it behaves when you interact with it.
I see. So it's not just this static list of facts. It's this dynamic kind of understanding of how this thing exists in the world and how you relate to it.
Exactly. And that's really the heart of Hawkins' argument, is that the brain is constantly building these models of the world.
Okay. So then how does the brain actually create these models?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
So Hawkins and his team, they had this really pivotal discovery back in 2016, where they realized that the neocortex, which is this outer layer of the brain, uses what are called reference frames to organize all of our knowledge.
Okay.
Now, a reference frame, it's basically like it's like a coordinate system.
Yeah.
Like think about a paper map.
Okay.
The grid lines on a paper map, that's your reference frame.
The latitude and longitude lines?
Exactly.
Okay.
So it provides a structure that allows you to see where things are in relation to each other and how to navigate between them.
Okay. So the brain is kind of building this model of the world using these map-like reference frames.
Yes.
Yeah.
And what's really amazing is that it's not just one big map.
Okay.
Hawkins thinks that there are hundreds of thousands of these reference frames that are constantly at work in the neocortex.
Wow. So it's like a library of maps that are constantly being updated and referenced.
That's a really good way to put it. Yeah, it's like the brain has this huge library of maps that it uses to understand and interact with the world.
Wow. That's pretty mind-blowing. And that when you talk about this idea of how the brain is structured, it makes me think of Vernon Mountcastle, who was a huge influence on Hawkins.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Mountcastle was a pioneer in neuroscience, and his work was really foundational to a lot of Hawkins's thinking.
So for people who might not be familiar with Mountcastle, what was his big idea?
Well, Mountcastle's big idea, as Hawkins calls it, was that the neocortex didn't evolve by adding a whole bunch of new parts.
Okay.
Instead, it grew by making copies of a basic circuit.
Oh, so it's like evolution kind of stumbled upon this really effective circuit and just kept copying it.
Yeah, it's like a modular design for intelligence.
Okay.
So he identified these structures called cortical columns and even smaller units called mini columns as these repeating modules. And he proposed that these columns all perform a similar basic function,
Okay.
and that their specialization, like whether they're processing vision or hearing or language, comes down to what they're connected to elsewhere in the brain.
Oh, so it's like the same basic building block, but the connections determine what it does.
Exactly. Connect a region of these columns to the eyes, and you get vision.
Okay.
Connect a similar region to the ears, and you get hearing.
Okay.
Connect them to other high-level areas, and you get language and abstract reasoning.
So essentially, it's like this one amazing trick that the brain can do, and it just applies it to all these different inputs and creates this incredible array of capabilities.
That's right, and there's some pretty compelling evidence to support this idea.
Yeah, like what kind of evidence?
Well, for one thing, if you look at the circuitry of the neocortex under a microscope, you see a very consistent structure across different regions.
Okay.
It's like looking at a tiled floor where all the tiles are the same shape, even though they might have different patterns on them. And then there's the fact that the human neocortex expanded very rapidly in evolutionary terms.
Right.
It happened much faster than you would expect if evolution was constantly inventing new systems.
So that kind of implies that evolution found something that worked really well and just went with it?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then you have things like the brain's incredible plasticity.
Okay.
You know, the fact that blind people can have their visual cortex repurposed to process other senses like touch or hearing.
Right.
That suggests that there's this underlying uniformity to the neocortex.
Okay, so the fact that it can rewire itself so easily means that maybe those areas weren't that different to begin with.
That's right.
Okay.
And then there's the fact that we can learn completely new things.
Yeah.
Like things that our brains certainly didn't evolve to do.
Like coding or abstract mathematics?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That points to a very general purpose learning mechanism that's likely residing in these cortical columns.
Right, so it's not like there's a dedicated area for learning how to code that just, was sitting there dormant for thousands of years.
Right.
It's more like this general purpose learning mechanism that can be applied to anything.
Exactly.
Okay, so Mountcastle comes up with this really elegant theory, but was it immediately accepted?
Well, no, it was actually quite controversial at the time.
Okay.
And to be fair, there are still aspects of it that are debated today.
Okay.
But one of the main sticking points was that Mountcastle himself didn't actually know what the specific computation was that a cortical column performed.
Oh, so he had the structure, but not the function.
Exactly.
Okay.
He had this compelling theory based on all these observations about structure and evolution, but he couldn't explain how these seemingly identical columns could give rise to such a wide range of cognitive abilities.
Right. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine how the same basic machinery could be responsible for something like vision, which feels so immediate and sensory, and then something like language, which feels much more abstract and symbolic.
Yeah, that's one of the big challenges of understanding the brain is that our subjective experience of different cognitive functions can feel so different.
Right.
But the evidence suggests that there's a lot more commonality going on under the hood than we might think.
So where does Hawkins fit into all of this?
Well, Hawkins was deeply inspired by Mountcastle's work.
Okay.
In fact, he tells this great story about meeting Mountcastle at Johns Hopkins.
Okay.
And it's funny because it's kind of the opposite of what happened to him at UC Berkeley, where he had actually applied to study brain theory but was rejected.
Oh, wow. So he kind of turned away by one of the top institutions and then ended up working with one of the leading figures in the field.
Yeah, it just goes to show that you never really know where your path is going to take you.
Yeah, that's true.
Hmm.
So what happened when Hawkins met Mountcastle?
Well, Mountcastle offered him a position in his lab and really encouraged him to pursue his ideas about the neocortex.
Okay.
And it was really this meeting that sparked Hawkins's lifelong passion to understand the brain. He felt like he had been given this mission by Mountcastle to complete his work.
Wow, and that's a pretty big mission.
It is, yeah.
So what was Hawkins' big breakthrough?
Well, after years of research, Hawkins came to a profound realization.
Okay.
He realized that prediction was a ubiquitous function of the neocortex.
Okay, what did that mean?
It means that the brain is constantly trying to predict what's going to happen next.
Oh, so it's not just passively taking in information, it's actively anticipating what's coming.
Exactly. And this is a really fundamental shift in how we view the brain,
Okay.
because it suggests that the brain is not just a reactive organ, but a proactive one.
Okay.
It's not just responding to the world, it's constantly trying to stay ahead of it.
So give me an example of how this prediction works in practice.
Well, think about something as simple as walking through your house.
Okay.
You can effortlessly recall an incredible amount of detail about each room.
Yeah.
Where the furniture is, what's on the walls, what the lighting is like.
Right.
And all of that knowledge is being used to predict what you'll see, hear, and even feel as you move through those familiar spaces.
Okay, so even though it feels like I'm just walking through my house,
Yeah.
my brain is actually making thousands of tiny predictions about what I'm going to experience.
Exactly. And those predictions are what allow you to move so smoothly and effortlessly through your environment.
Wow. And I guess if something unexpected happens, like if I trip over a toy that my kid left out, that's when I become consciously aware of the prediction failing.
Exactly. That sudden mismatch between your prediction and reality is what grabs your attention.
Okay, so prediction is this really crucial function of the brain, and it's happening all the time without us even realizing it.
That's right.
So then how does this prediction actually work at the level of neurons?
Well, that's where things get even more interesting.
Okay.
So for a long time, the thinking was that there might be two types of neurons.
Okay.
One type that just senses things, and another type that predicts things.
Okay, so kind of like specialized neurons for each task.
Yeah, but that theory ran into some problems.
Okay.
For one thing, neuroscientists haven't actually found nearly enough of these dedicated prediction neurons.
Yeah.
And more importantly, if our brains are making so many predictions all the time, why aren't we aware of them?
Right. It's not like I'm constantly thinking about what's going to happen next.
Yeah, it all seems to be happening below the level of conscious awareness.
Okay, so how does Hawkins explain this?
Well, he has this really intriguing theory about something called dendrite spikes.
Okay, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. So dendrites are these branch-like extensions that come out of neurons,
Okay.
and they're responsible for receiving signals from other neurons.
Okay.
Now, what Hawkins is suggesting is that predictions are actually happening within the dendrites themselves.
Oh, so it's not a separate neuron that's doing the predicting. It's like a part of the neuron that's doing the predicting.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
he thinks that these dendrites can generate these little electrical spikes that can change the neuron's internal state and make it more likely to fire. But these dendrite spikes don't necessarily travel down the axon the way a regular firing signal does.
Okay.
So that could explain why we're not consciously aware of them.
So it's like the prediction is happening kind of in the background without directly affecting the main output of the neuron.
That's right. It's like a priming mechanism that's always running.
Okay, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
So we've got these dendrite spikes that are potentially doing the predicting, and then we've got these reference frames that are organizing all of our knowledge.
Right.
So how do those two things connect?
Well, if you think about it, if the brain is constantly predicting sensory input based on our movements, it needs a stable framework to organize all of that information.
Okay.
Think back to that example of walking through your house.
Okay.
Your brain needs a way to keep track of where you are in relation to all of the objects in your house.
Right.
And it needs to do this even as you're moving around and your perspective is changing.
Okay.
So what Hawkins is suggesting is that the brain uses these reference frames that are attached to objects themselves.
Okay, so it's like each object has its own little coordinate system.
Exactly. And then the
Right.
brain can track the locations of different features within those reference frames.
Okay, so like if I'm looking at a chair, my brain has a reference frame for the chair itself.
Right.
And then it's tracking the location of the legs, the seat, the back, all within that reference frame.
Exactly. And this allows the brain to learn the structure of the object by understanding the spatial relationships between its parts.
Okay, that makes sense. So the reference frames provide this kind of stable framework for the predictions to happen in.
That's right. And it also helps to explain how we can recognize objects from different angles and in different contexts.
Right, because the reference frame is tied to the object itself, not to our particular viewpoint.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about maps and reference frames and all this spatial stuff. And that makes me think of the discovery of grid cells and place cells.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Those were groundbreaking discoveries that really transformed our understanding of how the brain maps space.
So could you give us a quick overview of what grid cells and place cells are and what they do?
Sure. So grid cells were discovered in 2005, and they're these fascinating neurons that fire in a grid-like pattern.
Okay.
Like imagine a sheet of graph paper.
Okay.
And each time the animal is in a particular location on that graph paper, a certain grid cell will fire.
Okay, so it's like the grid cell is representing a specific point in space.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that these grid cells fire in a very regular pattern.
Okay.
So you have one grid cell that fires every time the animal is at a certain distance from the starting point.
Okay.
And then you have another grid cell that fires every time the animal is a slightly different distance from the starting point.
Okay.
And so on and so forth. So it's like the brain is creating this internal coordinate system using these grid cells.
Okay, that's amazing. And then what about place cells?
Well, place cells were discovered even earlier in the 1970s, and they fire when an animal is in a specific location within an environment.
Okay, so like if I have a place cell for my desk, it'll fire whenever I'm sitting at my desk.
Exactly. And together, grid cells and place cells form this really comprehensive map of the animal's environment.
Okay, so the grid cells provide the coordinate system, and the place cells tell you where you are within that system.
That's right.
Okay, and we humans have these cells too.
Yeah, absolutely. We have both grid cells and place cells in our brains,
Right.
and they're what allow us to navigate even in the dark or with our eyes closed,
Yeah.
because we have this internal map of our surroundings that's constantly being updated.
So I'm never truly lost as long as my grid cells and place cells are working properly.
That's right. You always have some sense of where you are in the world.
That's a comforting thought.
Ugh.
So Hawkins takes this idea of grid cells and place cells, and he kind of runs with it, right?
Oh, yeah, he does. He suggests that it's not just a single map, but rather a stack of map squares,
Yeah.
representing all the different environments and contexts that we know.
Okay, so like I've got a map for my house, a map for my office, a map for my favorite park.
Exactly. And this allows the brain to not only know where you are physically, but also what the broader context is.
Okay, so it's like knowing not just your street address, but also what city you're in.
Exactly.
Okay, that's really cool.
Yeah.
And then he uses this great analogy of reaching into a dark box and feeling an object
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
to illustrate how movement helps us to resolve uncertainty.
Yeah, it's like if you reach into a dark box and you feel something, you don't know what it is right away.
Right.
But by moving your hand around it, you can start to build up a mental model of its shape and its texture.
Okay.
And you're doing this by simultaneously exploring the object and determining the location of your hand relative to its surface.
So it's like the movement is providing you with the information you need to build that model.
Exactly. And Hawkins argues that this is how the brain learns about the world in general.
Okay, so it's not just about passively receiving information, it's about actively exploring and interacting with the world.
That's right.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about these maps and reference frames and how they apply to physical space. But Mountcastle's theory was that the neocortex is using the same basic circuit for all of its functions.
Right.
So does that mean that these reference frames are also used for more abstract concepts?
Hawkins thinks so, yeah.
Okay.
He argues that reference frames aren't just for physical objects and spatial navigation.
Okay.
They're also used to organize our knowledge about things that we can't directly perceive.
Okay, like what?
Well, like subatomic particles.
Okay.
Or the vastness of the Milky Way galaxy.
Okay, so things that are either too small or too big for us to see.
Exactly. And Hawkins thinks that we understand these things by mentally visualizing them in a spatial context.
Okay, so even though I can't see an atom, I can still create a mental model of it that has spatial properties.
Exactly.
Okay, it's interesting. But what about things that are truly abstract,
Yeah.
like democracy or mathematics?
Right.
How do you create a spatial model for something like that?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's something that Hawkins is still working on.
Okay.
But he thinks that even our most abstract concepts are ultimately grounded in some kind of spatial representation,
Okay.
and that these representations might involve more than just the 3 dimensions that we're used to.
Okay, so like higher dimensional spaces
Yeah.
that we can't really visualize, but that our brains can still work with.
Exactly.
Okay, that's pretty mind-blowing.
Yeah.
So we've got these reference frames that are potentially being used for all sorts of things, from navigating physical space to understanding abstract concepts.
Right.
And this idea of mapping keeps coming up.
It does. Yeah.
So are there any other examples in the brain of this kind of mapping?
Well, there's the what and where pathways.
Okay, tell me about those.
So these are 2 parallel processing strings in the brain.
Okay.
One is responsible for identifying objects. That's the what pathway.
Okay.
And the other is responsible for processing their spatial location. That's the where pathway.
Okay, so like if I see a coffee cup, The what pathway tells me it's a coffee cup, and the where pathway tells me it's on the table.
Exactly. And these pathways have been studied extensively in the visual system.
Okay.
But Hawkins points out that similar pathways seem to exist for other senses as well.
Oh, so like touch and hearing.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it seems like the brain has this really fundamental need to both identify and locate things.
Right, regardless of what sense is providing the information.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got all this evidence that the brain is using maps and reference frames for all sorts of things. But is there any direct evidence that these grid cells that we talked about earlier are actually in the neocortex?
Well, that's a really good question, and it's something that scientists have been trying to figure out for a while.
Oh.
But there have been some really interesting fMRI studies that suggest that grid cells might be present in the neocortex.
Okay.
So fMRI stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging.
Right.
And it's a way of measuring brain activity. So researchers like Berry and Burgess, they did these experiments where they had people navigate through virtual environments.
Oh, wait.
And they found that certain areas of the neocortex showed activity patterns that were very similar to the grid cell firing patterns that had been observed in rodents.
Wow, so that's pretty strong evidence that grid cells might be involved in more than just spatial navigation.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then there's another study by Constantinescu, O'Reilly, and Behrens that suggests that the neocortex might be using grid cell-like neurons to organize conceptual knowledge as well.
Okay, tell me about that study.
So in this study, they showed people images of birds.
Okay.
And these birds varied systematically in the length of their necks and legs.
Okay.
And what they found was that the brain activity patterns suggested that the neocortex was organizing these birds into a kind of map, where one dimension of the map represented neck length and the other dimension represented leg length.
So like a two-dimensional grid of birds.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And when people were thinking about these birds, their brain activity patterns indicated that they were mentally moving through this conceptual space.
Wow, so it's like they were navigating through a map of bird features.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is that the people in the study weren't consciously aware of this map-like organization.
Oh, wow. So it was happening below the level of conscious awareness.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's pretty strong evidence that the neocortex is using these spatial mapping mechanisms for more than just physical space.
That's right.
It's using them for abstract concepts as well.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got all these cortical columns building their own models of the world using reference frames.
Right.
And we've got this voting mechanism that's somehow creating our unified perception of reality.
All right.
But how's all of this come together?
Well, that's where Hawkins introduces his Thousand Brains theory,
Okay.
which is really the culmination of all of his thinking about the brain.
So what is the Thousand Brains theory?
Well, it starts with the idea that the traditional model of vision, which is called the hierarchy of features model, has some serious flaws. This traditional model sees vision as this bottom-up process, where the brain starts by detecting simple features like edges and lines.
Okay.
And then it combines those features into more complex shapes.
Okay.
And then it combines those shapes into even more complex objects.
Okay, so it's like a pyramid with simple features at the bottom and complex objects at the top.
Exactly. But Hawkins argues that this model is too simplistic.
Okay.
It doesn't account for the crucial role of movement in perception,
Right.
or the fact that the brain is constantly making predictions.
Right.
And it also doesn't explain how the brain solves the binding problem.
Okay, what's the binding problem?
Well, the binding problem is the question of how the brain creates a unified perception of the world.
Okay.
When the information coming from our different senses is processed in different parts of the brain.
Right, like the visual information about a coffee cup is processed in one area, and the tactile information is processed in another area.
Exactly.
So how does the brain know to combine all of that information into a single experience of a coffee cup?
That's the binding problem.
Okay, so how does Hawkins solve this problem?
Well, he says that the brain doesn't actually have a single unified model of the world.
Okay.
Instead, he proposes that each cortical column is creating its own model of the world,
Okay.
and that there are thousands of these models all running in parallel.
So it's like 1,000 little brains all working together.
That's right.
Okay.
And he calls this the Thousand Brains theory.
Okay. I like it. So how does this theory solve the binding problem?
Well, Hawkins says that our unified perception of the world is actually the result of a voting process.
Okay.
So each cortical column is essentially casting a vote for what it thinks is out there in the world.
Okay.
And the perception that we experience is the one that gets the most votes.
Oh, so it's like a democracy of the mind.
Exactly. And this voting process is happening constantly and seamlessly.
Okay.
So we're never aware of the individual votes being cast.
Okay.
We just experience the final outcome.
Okay. That's really cool. But how do the columns know what to vote for?
Well, they're each building their own models of the world based on the sensory input they receive.
Okay.
And they're also sharing information with each other about the relative positions of different features.
Okay, so it's like they're all comparing notes and trying to come to a consensus.
Exactly. And this voting mechanism also explains why our perception of the world is so stable,
Okay.
even when our sensory input is constantly changing.
Right, because the overall consensus among the columns is staying relatively constant.
Exactly.
Okay, so the thousand brains theory is a really radical departure from the traditional view of the brain.
It is, yeah.
But it seems like it has the potential to explain a lot of things that the traditional model couldn't.
Yeah, I think so too.
So what are the implications of this theory?
Well, I think it has the potential to revolutionize our understanding of intelligence.
Okay.
Not just biological intelligence, but artificial intelligence as well.
Yeah.
Because if we can understand how the brain creates intelligence, maybe we can build machines that are intelligent in the same way.
Right. It's like we've been trying to build AI based on this flawed model of the brain.
Exactly.
And now we have a new model that might be much more accurate.
That's right.
Okay. So Hawkins is basically saying that we need to rethink everything we thought we knew about the brain.
Yeah, pretty much.
And that this new understanding has the potential to change the world.
Yeah, I think it does.
Wow. So before we wrap up, I just wanted to mention this one last anecdote from the book that I thought was really interesting.
Okay.
So Hawkins talks about his final conversation with Vernon Mountcastle.
Oh, yeah.
And as Hawkins was leaving, Mountcastle told him to stop talking about hierarchy.
Wow.
Yeah, and Hawkins was kind of taken aback by this.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Because hierarchy is such a fundamental concept in neuroscience.
It is, yeah.
But Mountcastle is basically saying that it's not as important as we think it is.
Interesting.
Yeah, and Hawkins later came to realize that his own thinking about hierarchy had evolved over time,
Okay.
and that he had come to see it as much less rigid than he had initially thought.
So Mountcastle was kind of ahead of his time on that one.
Yeah, I think so.
It's like he had this intuitive understanding of how the brain worked that went beyond the prevailing dogma.
Yeah, and it's kind of sad that Hawkins didn't get to discuss this more with Mountcastle.
Yeah, it would have been fascinating to hear their conversation.
Yeah, definitely. So I think that's a good place to leave it for today.
Okay.
This has been an amazing deep dive into a truly groundbreaking book.
Yeah, it's really made me rethink some things.
Yeah, me too. So just to summarize, the core of the Thousand Brains theory is this. The brain builds models of the world using a vast number of reference frames that are created by individual cortical columns.
Right.
Prediction is a fundamental function of these columns. And our unified perception of reality emerges from a voting process among these thousands of independent models.
Exactly.
So I think the big takeaway here is that intelligence is much more distributed and decentralized than we might think.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point.
And it's something that we need to keep in mind as we continue to explore the brain and develop new forms of AI.
Absolutely.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. If you have thousands of brains in your head, all working together, how does that change your view of yourself?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, I mean, it makes you wonder if there's really a single you in there,
Yeah.
or if it's more like a society of minds.
That's a really interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, so I encourage you to go out and read Hawkins' book and explore these ideas further.
Yeah, it's definitely worth the read.
All right, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.